Hello, our dear viewers, and welcome to our news coverage. I'm Mahisti Rabia. And our news coverage is covering all the latest in the world. And we'll start with President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who arrived home on Wednesday after attending the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and held a number of meetings with world leaders and senior state officials over bilateral ties as well as regional and international issues of mutual concern. Leaders of the world's 20 major economies called for a global pact to combat hunger, more aid for war-torn Gaza, and an end to hostilities in the Middle East, and Ukraine issuing a joint declaration that was heavy on generalities but short of details on how to accomplish these goals.
President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi arrived home on Wednesday after attending the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Before his departure, President el-Sisi held talks with Singaporean Prime Minister on the sidelines of G20 meetings in Brazil, which centered on bilateral ties in addition to a number of regional and international issues of mutual concern. Also, the head of state held talks with Nigerian President, which tackled bilateral ties as well as means to foster peace and security in Africa, with the aim of realizing 2063 agenda for sustainable development. Meanwhile, President el-Sisi held talks with Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Khalid bin Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, over bilateral ties. He also met with Tanzanian Samia Hassan, focusing on means to deepen the historic and strong brotherly relations binding the two countries in light of the shared keenness in a bid to enhance all forms of cooperation, especially in economic and trade files. The meeting further addressed ways of strengthening cooperation among the Nile Basin countries to enhance coordination and consensus among them, with focus on achieving the interests of their peoples. Leaders of the world's 20 major economies called for a global pact to combat hunger, more aid for war-torn Gaza, and an end to hostilities in the Middle East and Ukraine, issuing a joint declaration that was heavy on generalities but short of details on how to accomplish those goals. The two-day gathering wrapped up with a plea from Brazilian President for the world's most powerful leaders to rescue stalled UN climate talks in Azerbaijan, calling it a matter of the planet's survival. Joe Biden, attending his last summit as U.S. President before he hands power to Donald Trump, a noted climate skeptic, also appealed for urgent action. Ukraine's allies and Russia traded blame for a dramatic escalation in the war in Europe, which dominated the final day of talks at the G20 summit.
And to shed more light on the G20 summit, we are very much delighted to be joined over the phone by Dr. Mongy Badr, the Minister, Commissioner and Board Member of UN Association Egypt. Good afternoon to you, Dr. Mongy.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Thank you so much, sir, for being our guest.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
It's always a pleasure, sir. Dr. Badr, what is the significance of President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's attendance of the G20 summit in Brazil, and how far the meetings he held on the sidelines of the summit have turned to be fruitful from your point of view?
In fact, it's Egypt's fourth participation in the group's summit, after participation in 2016 in China, and 2019 in Japan, and the last one, it was in India, in New Delhi, 2023.
Yes.
This reflecting the appreciation of Egypt international weight and its pivotal role at the regional and international level. If you allow me, let me shed light more on the speech of His Excellency Mr. President Sisi. It was, in fact, very comprehensive and informative speech on Egypt's development effort and the challenge in facing developing countries, regional condition, and Israeli escalation in Palestine and Lebanon.
Yes.
On the sideline of the summit, His Excellency Mr. President met with many world leaders.
Yes.
This, in fact, it's what we call presidency diplomacy.
Of course.
In fact, this kind of diplomacy was enlarged after His Excellency Sisi came to his office 2014. And this is a lot of problems and strengthen the bilateral and the multilateral relation between Egypt and other countries and also international institutions.
Indeed. Dr. Badr, what are the main outcomes of the two-day summit, especially regarding the situation in the Gaza Strip, the war in Ukraine, and the climate change issue as well?
Let me shed light in general first about the summit. What they discussed. In fact, they discussed a number of priority topics, including social inclusion and combating poverty and hunger. Second one, it was reforming global governance institution. The third one, it was energy transformation within the frame and the sustainable development, regional condition, and related the crisis facing the Middle East region in the light of the instability it's witnessing with continued Israeli escalation in Palestine and Lebanon. In fact, also the summit discussed the war in Ukraine, related the situation of Palestine. In fact, I can say that G20 affirmed the right of Palestinians to self-determination and an unwavering commitment to the two-state solution, with Israel and Palestine state living side by side in peace within secure and recognized border in the line with international law and the relevant United Nations resolution.
Indeed. Dr. Mongy Badr, Minister, Commissioner, Board Member of UN Association Egypt, thank you so much, sir, for your precious input. Our viewers will go to a short break, and after that we'll be back to continue our special coverage, so stay tuned.
Be the first to know. The news live at the site of the event. Information on events as they are happening. If it's breaking news, it's Nile TV.
The Israeli occupation forces killed at least 15 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip on Wednesday, including a rescue worker, as tanks deepened their incursion in the area and blew up homes. More details in the following story.
Israeli occupation forces killed at least 15 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip on Wednesday, including a rescue worker, as tanks deepened their incursion in the area and blew up homes. Medics said at least 12 people were killed in an Israeli strike on a house in the area of Jabalia in northern Gaza earlier on Wednesday. They said at least 10 people remained missing as rescue operations continued. Another man was killed in tank shelling nearby. In the Sabra suburb of Gaza City, the Palestinian Civil Emergency said an Israeli airstrike targeted one of their teams during a rescue operation, killing one staff and wounding 3 others. The death raised the number of Civil Emergency Service members killed since October 7, 2023 to 87. Meanwhile, there was no immediate Israeli comment on the 2 incidents. Adding to the challenges facing the healthcare system in North Gaza areas, the Civil Emergency Service said their vehicles were hardly operational because of shortages of fuel and equipment, citing Israel's continued refusal to allow them to bring the needed supplies. In Rafah, in the southern Gaza Strip, medics said 1 man was killed and others wounded in an Israeli airstrike on the eastern territory of the city. Residents in Jabalia, Beit Lahia and Beit Hanun, where the army has operated since early last month, said forces blew up dozens of houses in the 3 areas, adding to fears Israel was seeking to clear residents to create a buffer zone, something Israel denies.
Ukraine used the US ATACMS missiles to strike the Russian territories on Tuesday, taking advantage of newly granted permission from the outgoing administration of US President Joe Biden on the 1000th day of the war in Ukraine. On the same day, Putin approved a policy document that lowers the threshold for Russia to use nuclear weapons in response to attacks by an enemy using conventional weapons. More details in the following story.
China on Wednesday urged calm and restraint after Russian President Vladimir Putin issued a nuclear threat and Ukraine fired longer-range US missiles at its territory for the first time. Speaking to journalists, French leader Emmanuel Macron said that he had asked Chinese President Xi Jinping during a meeting at the G20 summit in Brazil to use all his influence with Putin to try to achieve a de-escalation. Macron said that China had the capacity to negotiate with President Putin so that he halts his attacks on Ukraine. On Tuesday, Putin signed a decree that enables Moscow to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states such as Ukraine if they are supported by nuclear powers. A senior official said that a strike on Russia's Bryansk region earlier on Tuesday, following the decree, was carried out by the US-supplied Army tactical missile system. The White House, the UK and the European Union condemned Putin's nuclear decree as irresponsible. The Kremlin said the option of freezing the Ukraine conflict did not suit Russia, although it restated that President Putin was open to negotiations. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov declined to comment on the decision by the US Embassy in Kiev to close and issue a warning about a potential significant air attack, referring the question to the Defense Ministry. Moscow has reacted furiously to a decision by the US President Joe Biden to change policy on Ukraine and allow Kiev to use US-supplied long-range missiles to strike Russian territory for the first time. China represents itself as a neutral party in the Ukraine war and says it is not sending lethal assistance to either side, unlike the United States and other Western nations.
Negotiators told to break a deadlock at the UN climate talks after G20 leaders acknowledged the need for trillions of dollars for poorer nations, but left key sticking points unresolved.
With 2 days left in the COP29 conference, ministers haggling the Azerbaijan had been waiting for the G20 meeting in Rio de Janeiro to issue a declaration that might jumpstart the stalled negotiations. The lead negotiator of COP29, host Azerbaijan, said the G20 statement sent positive signals to the efforts in Baku. UN climate chief Simon Steele said in a statement G20 delegations had their marching orders from the Baku. He said they urgently need all nations to bypass the posturing and move swiftly towards common ground across all issues. Activists and diplomats gave the text a mixed verdict, saying the statement lacked enough direction on climate finance and failed to explicitly mention the need to transition away from fossil fuels. Rich nations are being urged to significantly raise their pledge of 100 billion euros in a year to help developing countries adapt to climate change and transition to clean energy. But efforts to finalize the deal in Baku are hampered by disputes over how much the deal should entail, who should pay for it, and what types of financing should be included. The declaration, however, recognizes the need for rapidly and substantially scaling up climate finance from billions to trillions from all sources. It also states the need to increase international collaboration with a view to scaling up public and private climate finance and investment for developing countries. A negotiator for the Alliance of Small Island States said the G20 paragraph on climate finance is not saying much. For his part, the head of the 55-nation African Union delegation at COP29 said the G20 had a statement of goodwill. A new draft deal on climate finance is expected by Wednesday night. Some developing countries, which are the least responsible for global greenhouse gas emissions, want an annual commitment of 1.3 trillion euros. Developed nations facing their own debt problems and budget deficits say the private sector must play a key role in climate finance. The United States and the European Union are pushing for the donor base to be expanded to include countries such as China, which has become the world's second biggest economy, but is still officially listed as a developing nation.
Stocks fluctuated on Wednesday, following a positive lead from Wall Street as the traders assessed the prospect of an escalation in the Russian-Ukrainian war, Donald Trump's second presidency, and the outlook for the U.S. interest rates.
Stocks fluctuated on Wednesday following a positive lead from Wall Street as traders assessed the prospect of an escalation in the Russia-Ukraine war, Donald Trump's second presidency, and the outlook for U.S. interest rates. Trump has pledged to ramp up tariffs on imports, with China particularly in his sights, but observers warn that such a move, along with planned tax cuts, could relight still stubborn inflation. That has damped hopes for several Federal Reserve interest rate cuts next year. Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine has burst back into the thoughts of traders as Moscow vowed to react accordingly after saying Kyiv had fired its first U.S.-made long-range missile into Russian territory. Washington this week said it had cleared Kyiv to use the U.S.-supplied Army tactical missile system against military targets inside Russia, a long-standing Ukrainian request. Growing worries that the war will ramp up to another, more dangerous level weighed on sentiment in Europe, but the S&P 500 and Nasdaq rose for a second straight day in New York. Asia began in the red, but some markets managed to turn things around as the day wore on. Tokyo, Sydney, Singapore, Wellington, Taipei, Bangkok and Jakarta were in retreat, but Hong Kong, Shanghai, Seoul and Manila rose. London edged up as data showed UK inflation rose more than expected in October. Paris and Frankfurt also advanced. The main focus of attention on Wednesday is the upcoming earnings from Nvidia, the world's most expensive listed company and market darling. There are hopes it will live up to expectations and provide some insight into its new chips. The firm's shares rose nearly 5% on Tuesday.
The United States could impose nearly 40% tariffs on imports from China early next year, potentially slicing growth in the world's second biggest economy by up to 1 percentage point. More details in the following story.
The United States could impose nearly 40% tariffs on imports from China early next year, potentially slicing growth in the world's second biggest economy by up to 1 percentage point. A poll, the first on China's economy since Donald Trump's sweeping election victory on November 5th, also predicts that the president-elect will resist starting off with blanket pledge during campaigning to slap heavy tariffs on Chinese imports as part of a package of America's first trade measures, causing unease in Beijing and heightening growth risks for China. Not only are the threatened tariff rates much higher than 7.5% to 25% levied on China during his first term. The economy is a much more vulnerable position given the prolonged property downturn, debt risks and weak domestic demand. A poll of more than 50 economists showed a strong majority both in and outside mainland China expect Trump to impose the tariffs by early next year, with a median estimate of 38% to projections ranging from 15% to 60%. Most respondents said they do not expect blanket 60% tariffs on Chinese goods in early 2025, as this could accelerate inflation within the United States. Analysts say that Chinese policymakers who have ramped up stimulus to spur growth since late September face increased pressure next year to spur domestic demand to offset an expected drop in exports, a key growth driver this year. On the potential impact on China, the poll predicted that new U.S. tariffs would reduce China's 2025 economic growth by around 0.5 to 1 percentage point. For now, however, most of the economists polled have maintained their median growth forecast for this year and 2025 at 4.8% and 4.5% respectively, consonant with projections made before the U.S. elections. Growth is expected to slow further to 4.2% in 2026.
Rafael Nadal says he has left both sporting and personal legacy after retiring from the professional tennis following Spain's elimination from the Davis Cup.
Rafael Nadal bit his lower lip and his reddened eyes welled with tears as he stood alongside his Davis Cup teammates for Spain's national anthem on Tuesday before what he and everyone knew might be the last match of his career. Rafael Nadal bit his lower lip and his reddened eyes welled with tears as he stood alongside his Davis Cup teammates for Spain's national anthem on Tuesday before what he and everyone knew might be the last match of his career. Hours after Nadal's 6-4, 6-4 loss to Botic van de Zandschulp of the Netherlands was over, the evening did turn out to represent the 22-time Grand Slam champion's farewell to professional tennis, because the Dutch eliminated the Spaniards in the quarterfinals just after midnight. And it was during an on-court post-match ceremony to honor Nadal that he cried and cried at the sing-song chorus of Rafa from the spectators, and the video showing highlights from his more than 2 decades on tour and a collection of recorded tributes from current or former players such as his big three rivals Roger Federer and Novak Djokovic, Serena Williams, Conchita Martinez and Andy Murray, and stars from other sports such as golf's Sergio Garcia or soccer's David Beckham. The 38-year-old Nadal told the flag-waving Saint Toten crowd at the sold-out Palacio de Deportes José María Martín Carpena that the titles, the numbers are there so people probably know that, but that the way he would like to be remembered is as a good person from a small village in Mallorca. Just a kid that followed their dreams, worked as hard as possible. He has been very lucky. However, he acknowledged after playing the emotions were difficult to manage and that he felt nervous out that amid the roars of an adoring audience that mostly showed up for one player and one player only.
Visitors to London's famous Kew Garden this Christmas will get to walk through a festive nighttime trail that uses lights to bring the garden to life.
London's Kew Gardens open their annual light trail. Visitors to London's famous Kew Gardens this Christmas will get to walk through a festive nighttime trail that uses lights to bring the garden to life. Back for a 12th year, Christmas at Kew includes some favorites such as the light show at Palm House as well as a couple of brand new installations. Although the event is fun, the botanical gardens, which were first opened in 1759 and today are a UNESCO World Heritage Site, hope the trail offers a link to the natural world. One of the most important aspects of Christmas at Kew Garden is for people to bond with nature. The trees are some of the biggest stars of the show. It is all about the wonder of nature, the architecture of the trees. Christmas at Kew runs until Sunday, January 5th, 2025.
Well, our dear viewers, that will bring us to the end of our special coverage for now. And I'm Mahisti Rabia signing off. Many thanks for watching.